The morning Joel Conroy was set to marry, he found not a bride waiting at the altar, but an empty room, a cold bed, and a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a brass candlestick that read nothing but directions drawn in a woman's careful hand. It was the spring of 1878, in the dusty cattle town of Willow Bend, Kansas, where the wind carried the smell of prairie grass and the promise of rain that never seemed to come. Joel Conroy had built his ranch from nothing after the war, clearing sod with his own two hands, raising cattle through drought and blizzard alike, until the Conroy spread was known throughout 3 counties as some of the finest grazing land west of the Missouri. He was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of labor, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of a November sky. He had never married, though not for lack of opportunity. The women of Willow Bend had tried for years to catch his eye, but Joel had always been too busy with fence posts and branding irons to notice much beyond his own herd. That changed the day Alice Walker stepped off the stagecoach with a single trunk and a letter of introduction from a preacher 2 counties over, claiming she had come west to marry a man she had corresponded with for the better part of a year, through an agency that arranged such things for lonely ranchers and lonelier women. Alice was 24, with hair the color of wheat before harvest and a spirit that did not bend easily to the harsh realities of frontier life, though she tried her best to appear as though it did. She had grown up in Ohio, the daughter of a schoolteacher who had died of consumption when Alice was 19, leaving her with little money and fewer prospects. The advertisement for a mail-order bride had seemed, at the time, like her only path toward a life of her own making. Joel had written the advertisement himself, though he was embarrassed to admit it even now. He was not a man given to poetry, but loneliness had a way of loosening a man's tongue, even on paper. He had described the ranch, the cattle, the wide Kansas sky, and had asked only that whoever answered be willing to work hard and laugh often. Alice's reply had been the only one that made him smile out loud, sitting alone at his kitchen table with a coyote howling somewhere out past the north pasture. They had exchanged letters for 11 months before Alice finally boarded the train that would carry her from Ohio to the edge of civilized America. Joel had ridden 2 days to meet her stagecoach, his best shirt starched stiff by the housekeeper who came twice a week, his hat brushed clean of trail dust. When Alice stepped down from that coach, her traveling dress wrinkled and her face pale with exhaustion, Joel had felt something shift inside his chest that he had no words for, not even in all his letters. 3 weeks they had courted properly then, under the watchful eye of the town, taking supper together at the boarding house, walking along the creek that ran behind the church, talking of small things and large ones alike. Alice had laughed at his jokes, even the poor ones, and Joel had found himself thinking of her smile at odd hours, while mending fence or driving cattle to water. The wedding had been set for a Saturday in April, with the whole town invited, and Reverend Hastings had already prepared his sermon on the sanctity of marriage before the eyes of God and the wide Kansas prairie. But on the Friday night before that wedding, Alice Walker vanished from the small room above the general store where she had been staying since her arrival, and left behind only that folded paper with its careful lines and markings, a map that led toward the western hills where few honest folks had cause to travel. Joel discovered her absence at dawn, when he rode into town with a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked himself along the creek bank, thinking to surprise his bride before the ceremony. Mrs. Prout, who kept the general store and had rented Alice the room above it, met him at the bottom of the stairs with her hands twisted in her apron and worry etched deep into the lines of her face. "She is gone, Mr. Conroy," Mrs. Prout said, her voice trembling. "I heard nothing in the night, not a sound, but her bed is empty and her trunk still sits there, though her good traveling boots are missing, and this was left on the pillow." Joel took the paper with hands that had gone suddenly cold despite the warming spring morning. He unfolded it slowly, half expecting some cruel joke, some explanation that Alice had simply changed her mind and fled back east without the courage to say so to his face. But what he found instead was a map, drawn in Alice's neat hand, showing a trail that wound from Willow Bend westward through Cottonwood Creek, past Sentinel Rock, and up into the hills where the Cheyennes sometimes camped in the warmer months. At the bottom of the map, in smaller letters, Alice had written only this: "Forgive me. I did not choose this. Follow if you can, but come alone and come careful. Tell no lawman." Joel read those words 3 times before the meaning settled into him like a stone dropped into still water. This was no jilting, no bride's cold feet before her wedding day. Alice Walker had been taken, and whoever had taken her had forced her, somehow, to leave this map, though for what purpose Joel could not yet fathom. Why would kidnappers allow their captive to leave a trail to follow? Unless Alice herself had found some desperate moment, some sliver of opportunity, to scrawl this warning and guidance before she was carried off into the hills. He did not waste time on speculation. Joel Conroy had spent enough years surviving on the frontier to know that action mattered more than fear, and fear was already rising in his throat like bile. He folded the map with careful hands and tucked it into his vest pocket, close against his heart, and turned to Mrs. Prout. "Did you hear any horses in the night? Any voices?" Mrs. Prout shook her head, tears now falling freely down her weathered cheeks. "Nothing, Mr. Conroy. I sleep heavy, always have. My husband used to say a cannon could not wake me. I am so sorry." "It is not your fault," Joel said, though his voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. "I need to speak with the sheriff." But even as he said the words, he remembered Alice's warning. Tell no lawman. Why would she write such a thing, unless she believed the sheriff himself might be involved, or unless whoever held her had eyes and ears throughout the town that would report any official investigation straight back to their captors? Joel stood in the dusty street outside the general store, the bouquet of wildflowers still clutched forgotten in his fist, and made a decision that would change the course of his life. He would go alone, as Alice had instructed, and he would follow her map into the western hills, though every instinct screamed at him to raise the alarm, to gather men and rifles and ride out with the full force of Willow Bend behind him. But if Alice had risked everything to leave that warning, he owed her the respect of heeding it. Sheriff Dalton Marsh was a heavy-set man with a walrus mustache and small, calculating eyes that Joel had never much cared for, though he had always assumed the man competent enough at keeping the peace. Joel found him at the jailhouse, boots up on his desk, whittling a piece of pine into what might eventually become a horse figure for his grandchildren. "Sheriff, I need to report a disappearance. My bride has gone missing." Marsh's boots came down slowly from the desk, and something flickered across his face too quick for Joel to name, though it left him uneasy. "Gone missing, you say, or gone running, more like? Women do get cold feet, Mr. Conroy, especially those brought out from back east who find our ways not to their liking." "She did not run," Joel said, keeping his voice level though anger simmered just beneath his words. "She left a map. Someone took her against her will." He almost showed Marsh the paper then, almost broke the promise implied by Alice's warning, but something in the sheriff's too quick dismissal of the danger, something in the way his eyes did not quite meet Joel's own, made him hesitate. Instead, Joel said only, "I intend to search for her myself. I wanted the law informed, in case I do not return within a week's time." "A week is a long time to be riding alone in country that still sees Cheyenne bands and worse," Marsh said, though he made no move to organize a posse or offer assistance. "You might consider waiting, Mr. Conroy. She may yet return on her own accord." Joel left the jailhouse more certain than before that something was deeply wrong, though he could not yet say what. He rode back to his ranch to prepare for the journey, his mind racing through possibilities. Perhaps Marsh was simply lazy, unwilling to organize a search for a woman he barely knew. Or perhaps there was something more sinister at work, some connection between the sheriff and whoever had taken Alice into those western hills. At the ranch, Joel's foreman, a grizzled old cowhand named Pete Sorensen, who had worked the Conroy spread since before Joel's father passed the land down, met him at the barn with obvious concern written across his weathered features. "You look like you seen a ghost, boss. What happened at the church? Where's your bride?" Joel explained quickly, showing Pete the map though not the warning written at its bottom, for he was uncertain even now who he could fully trust. Pete studied the careful lines Alice had drawn, tracing the path with one calloused finger. "This here goes up toward the old Hargrove claim," Pete said slowly. "Abandoned mining operation from a few years back up near Sentinel Rock. Folks say the vein ran dry, but there's always been talk that Hargrove found something before he pulled out, something he wasn't advertising to the assay office." "Gold?" Joel asked. "Could be, or silver. Something worth enough that a man might do desperate things to keep it quiet or to claim it for himself if Hargrove's ownership ever came into question." Pete looked up from the map, meeting Joel's eyes with grave concern. "You thinking Miss Walker got mixed up in something like that somehow?" "I do not know what to think," Joel admitted, "but I intend to find out. I need my horse saddled, provisions for a week, and my rifle. I am riding out within the hour." "You want company?" "I can saddle up quick, and old Charlie Bannister would come too, I reckon, if we asked him." Joel considered this, remembering Alice's warning to come alone. But he also knew the danger of riding into unknown territory without backup, especially if there were men willing to kidnap a bride from her very wedding to protect some secret buried in those hills. "I need to go alone, at least at first. If I have not returned within 3 days, you come looking and bring whoever you trust most. But give me those 3 days first." Pete's jaw tightened with obvious reluctance, but he nodded slowly. "3 days, boss. Not a day more. I'll have the men ready to ride the moment that third sunset comes without word from you." Joel spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for his journey, checking his rifle's action, packing hardtack and dried beef, and a small tin of matches, filling his canteens from the well behind the ranch house. He saddled his horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Samson who had carried him through countless cattle drives and knew the prairie almost as well as Joel himself. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet that Alice had once told him reminded her of a painting she had seen in a museum back in Ohio, Joel Conroy mounted up and rode out from his ranch, following the map that might lead him to salvation or to sorrow, though he prayed with every fiber of his being that it would be the former. The trail Alice had marked led first along Cottonwood Creek, where the water ran clear and shallow over smooth stones, lined with willows just beginning to leaf out in the spring warmth. Joel followed the creek for nearly 2 hours before the map indicated a turn northward, away from the water, and toward the rising hills that marked the edge of what most Willow Bend residents considered civilized territory. Beyond those hills lay land that still belonged, by treaty and by practice, largely to the Cheyenne and Arapaho peoples, though white settlers and prospectors had been pushing steadily into that territory for years, often with little regard for the agreements their government had made. As darkness fell, Joel made camp in a small hollow protected from the wind, though he did not light a fire, uncertain who might see its glow and come to investigate. He ate cold hardtack and dried beef, and tried to sleep, though sleep came only in fitful snatches, haunted by visions of Alice's face, by memories of her laughter during their brief courtship, by fear of what might have happened to her in the hours since her disappearance. He thought of the first time he had truly seen her, not just as a stranger arrived from the east, but as a woman with dreams and fears of her own. It had been their second week of courtship, and they had walked together along the creek behind the church, the same creek Joel had just followed westward. Alice had stopped suddenly, pointing toward a hawk circling high overhead, and had spoken with such wonder in her voice about the freedom of that bird's flight that Joel had found himself wondering if she saw something of herself in that image, some longing for freedom she had not yet found the words to express even to him. "Do you regret coming so far from everything you knew?" he had asked her then, genuinely uncertain of her answer. Alice had turned to him with those clear eyes that seemed to hold both strength and vulnerability in equal measure. "I regret nothing that brings me closer to a life of my own choosing, Mr. Conroy. My mother always said a woman's worth was measured by her marriage, but I have come to believe a woman's worth is measured by her courage. I had very little courage before I decided to answer your advertisement. I hope I am gaining some now." Those words had stayed with Joel through the following weeks, through their wedding preparations, through every stolen moment of conversation and connection that had built between them. Now, lying alone in a cold hollow miles from anywhere, Joel prayed that whatever courage Alice possessed would be enough to see her through whatever trial she now faced, until he could reach her side. Dawn broke cold and gray, with a light mist clinging to the low places in the land. Joel rose stiff and sore from his poor rest, saddled Samson, and continued following Alice's careful markings deeper into the hills. The terrain grew rougher as the morning progressed, rocky outcroppings replacing the gentle prairie swells of the previous day, scrub oak and cedar providing occasional cover among increasingly steep slopes. Around midday, Joel spotted something that made his heart race with sudden hope and fear combined. Fresh horse tracks crossing the trail he followed, at least 4 different animals judging by the prints, heading in the same general direction as Alice's map indicated. He dismounted to study the tracks more carefully, noting the depth of the impressions that suggested riders carrying heavier loads than usual, perhaps supplies, or perhaps a captive bound, and unable to ride freely on her own. He followed these tracks with renewed urgency, pushing Samson harder than he might have otherwise, though he remained careful to watch for any sign of ambush or danger. The hills grew steeper still, and by mid-afternoon, Joel found himself approaching a landmark he recognized from Pete's earlier description. Sentinel Rock, a massive formation of gray stone that rose nearly 80 feet above the surrounding terrain, visible for miles in every direction and clearly marked on Alice's map as well. Near the base of Sentinel Rock, Joel discovered the remains of a recent campsite, ashes still faintly warm to the touch, suggesting the riders he tracked had rested here only hours before his arrival. He studied the campsite carefully, noting boot prints of at least 3 different sizes among the ashes, along with smaller prints that might belong to a woman, prints that showed the distinctive pattern of a lady's traveling boot rather than the heavier work boots the men apparently wore. Alice had been here, and recently. Joel felt a surge of hope mixed with renewed determination, though he tried to temper his emotions with the caution the situation demanded. He needed to think clearly, to plan his approach carefully, rather than simply charging ahead with reckless haste that might endanger Alice further. As he remounted and continued following the trail beyond the campsite, Joel began to notice small marks along the path that seemed too deliberate to be accidental. A broken branch here, a scattered stone there, arranged in patterns that echoed the markings on Alice's map. He realized with growing amazement that Alice must be leaving additional signs along the actual trail itself, supplementing her original map with real-time guidance for anyone brave enough to follow. This realization filled him with fierce pride and renewed hope, for it suggested that Alice remained conscious, alert, and actively working toward her own rescue rather than simply being carried helplessly along by her captors. The trail eventually led Joel to the entrance of what had clearly once been an active mining operation, judging by the wooden support beams still visible around a dark opening in the hillside, and the scattered debris of abandoned equipment. Broken pickaxes, rusted shovels, a collapsed ore cart lying on its side near the entrance. This must be the old Hargrove claim that Pete had mentioned, the mining operation rumored to have found something valuable before its official abandonment. Joel dismounted well away from the mine entrance, tying Samson to a scrub oak and approaching the rest of the way on foot, his rifle held ready before him. He could see no immediate sign of the riders he had tracked, though smoke rose faintly from somewhere beyond the mine entrance, suggesting habitation nearby, perhaps a cabin or shelter used by whoever now occupied this abandoned claim. As he crept closer, staying low among the rocks and scrub vegetation, Joel began to hear voices carrying on the still afternoon air, though he could not yet make out specific words. He recognized one voice as definitely male, gruff and impatient in tone, while another voice, softer but still carrying clearly enough to identify, belonged unmistakably to Alice Walker. Relief flooded through Joel's chest at the sound of her voice, confirming that she remained alive and apparently unharmed enough to speak clearly. He moved closer still, careful to remain hidden among the rocks, until he could finally see the source of those voices. A small camp set up perhaps 50 yards beyond the mine entrance, consisting of 2 canvas tents and a hastily constructed corral holding several horses. 3 men occupied this camp, along with Alice, who sat on an overturned crate near the smaller of the 2 tents, her hands bound before her with rope, though her captors had apparently not thought to gag her or otherwise prevent her from speaking. The men themselves were rough-looking characters, dressed in the manner of prospectors or perhaps outlaws, with unkempt beards and weapons visible at their hips. Joel recognized none of them from Willow Bend, which suggested they were strangers to the area, perhaps drawn by rumors of the Hargrove claim's hidden wealth. He studied the camp carefully, noting the positions of each man, the location of their weapons, the general layout that might inform whatever rescue attempt he decided to make. The largest of the 3 men, a barrel-chested figure with a scarred face and graying beard, seemed to be in charge, issuing commands to the other 2 while occasionally glancing toward Alice with an expression that made Joel's blood run cold with protective fury. "You will tell us where Hargrove hid that map, girl, or your fancy rancher husband will find you buried up here in these hills, and no one will ever know the difference," the bearded man said, his voice carrying clearly to where Joel crouched in hiding. Alice's response carried equal parts fear and defiance, a combination that made Joel's heart swell with pride even as fear for her safety intensified his urgency to act. "I have told you already, I know nothing of any map beyond the one I drew myself, showing where you have dragged me against my will. Whatever Hargrove hid, he hid it before I ever arrived in this territory. I have no connection to his secrets." "Your uncle wrote you letters," the bearded man insisted. "We know this from the correspondence found among Hargrove's effects after his death. He mentioned sending something important to his niece, something he wanted kept safe from prying eyes." This revelation struck Joel like a physical blow. Hargrove had been Alice's uncle. She had never mentioned this connection during their courtship, though perhaps she had not known herself, or perhaps she had simply never found the right moment to share such information amid their other conversations. He filed this new knowledge away, understanding now the true motive behind Alice's kidnapping. These men believed she possessed knowledge of hidden wealth, likely gold or silver that her uncle had discovered before his mysterious death, wealth that these criminals intended to claim for themselves. "I received no such letters," Alice insisted, though something in her tone made Joel wonder if she spoke complete truth. "If my uncle sent anything to me, it never arrived. Perhaps it was lost in transit, or perhaps he changed his mind before sending it. I cannot help you find something I never possessed." The bearded man's expression darkened with obvious frustration and growing anger. "We have wasted enough patience on your claims of ignorance. Perhaps a night without food or water will improve your memory, or perhaps we should simply search your former lodgings back in Willow Bend more thoroughly. Either way, you will remain our guest until we recover what we seek." Joel watched as the bearded man turned away, apparently satisfied that his threats had been sufficiently made, moving toward the second tent, where the other 2 men had begun preparing what appeared to be a meager evening meal. This movement provided Joel with a brief window of opportunity, a moment when Alice sat relatively unguarded, her captor's attention diverted elsewhere. He knew he could not simply charge into the camp with guns blazing, not against 3 armed men, while Alice remained bound and vulnerable in their midst. Such reckless action might get her killed in the ensuing chaos. Instead, Joel forced himself to remain patient, to observe and plan, watching the camp's routine as afternoon light gradually faded toward evening. As darkness began to fall, the 3 men settled around a small campfire, sharing what appeared to be beans and hardtack, occasionally glancing toward Alice but making no move to feed her or otherwise attend to her comfort. Joel felt fury building within him at this casual cruelty, but he maintained his discipline, waiting for the darkness to deepen further before making his move. Around midnight, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the 3 men had apparently settled into sleep within their tents, Joel began his careful approach toward the camp. He moved with the patience born of years, spent tracking cattle and avoiding predators on the open range, placing each footstep with deliberate care to avoid any sound that might alert his enemies to his presence. He reached Alice's side without incident, finding her awake despite the late hour, her eyes widening with a mixture of relief and disbelief as she recognized him approaching through the darkness. "Joel," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "You found me. I hoped you would come, but I feared the risk was too great, that I was asking too much of you." "I would follow you to the ends of the earth, Alice Walker," Joel whispered back, kneeling beside her to work at the rope binding her wrists with quick, careful fingers. "Your map led me true. Are you injured? Have they harmed you?" "Only frightened," Alice replied, "and angry at my own helplessness these past hours. They came for me in the night, before I even fully woke, and forced me to write that map before dragging me from my room. They threatened Mrs. Prute's life if I made any sound to alert her." "You showed remarkable courage, leaving those additional signs along the trail," Joel said, finally freeing her wrists from their bindings. "How did you manage such a thing while under their watch?" Alice rubbed at her freed wrists, wincing slightly at the rope marks left behind. "They allowed me small moments alone during our journey, when they thought me too frightened or weak to attempt anything beyond simple obedience. I used those moments as best I could, breaking branches, scattering stones, praying you would notice and understand my meaning." "I understood," Joel confirmed, helping her rise carefully from the crate where she had been forced to sit. "We must leave now, quickly and quietly, before they wake and discover your absence." They moved away from the camp with careful stealth, Joel supporting Alice as her legs, stiff from hours of confinement, struggled to find their normal strength. They had covered perhaps 30 yards when a sudden sound behind them, the scrape of boot against stone, announced that their escape had been discovered. "They are gone. The girl has escaped." The bearded man's voice carried loud and urgent through the night air, followed immediately by the sound of movement as the 3 men scrambled from their tents in pursuit. "Run," Joel urged Alice, though he kept himself positioned between her and their pursuers, his rifle ready in his hands. "Toward the rocks where I left my horse. I will follow and cover our retreat." Alice needed no further urging, stumbling forward through the darkness with Joel close behind her, guiding her path as best he could while remaining alert for any sign of their pursuers gaining ground. They reached Samson within minutes, and Joel quickly helped Alice mount before swinging up behind her, his arms wrapping protectively around her waist as he urged the horse into motion. Behind them, gunfire erupted, though the shots seemed more designed to intimidate than to actually strike their fleeing targets, fired blindly into the darkness by men who could not clearly see their escaping quarry. Joel guided Samson away from the mine and toward the trail that would eventually lead back to Willow Bend, though he knew they could not simply race directly home without risking exhaustion for both horse and riders across such difficult terrain in darkness. Instead, he directed Samson toward a narrow ravine he had noticed during his earlier approach, a passage barely wide enough for a single horse, but offering the advantage of natural cover from any pursuit that might follow. They rode through this ravine for nearly an hour, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading behind them as their pursuers apparently lost the trail in the confusion of darkness. Finally, when Joel felt confident they had gained sufficient distance from immediate danger, he guided Samson to a halt in a small clearing surrounded by protective rock formations. Both he and Alice dismounted, exhaustion evident in every movement, though relief at their successful escape provided some measure of renewed energy. "We cannot return directly to Willow Bend," Joel said, as they settled onto the ground to rest briefly before continuing their journey. "Those men will likely search the obvious routes first, and I do not wish to risk leading them straight back to town where innocent people might be endangered." "What do you suggest instead?" Alice asked, her voice still trembling slightly from their harrowing escape, though her natural composure was gradually returning. "There is a longer route, following the creek further south before turning back east. It will add perhaps half a day to our journey, but it should help ensure we are not followed." Alice nodded her agreement, then hesitated before speaking again, her expression troubled by more than simple exhaustion. "Joel, there is something I must tell you, something I did not know myself until those men explained their reasons for taking me." "Your uncle Hargrove," Joel said gently. "I overheard them mention this connection while I watched their camp." Alice's eyes widened with surprise. "You know, I did not even know myself that I had an uncle by that name until they spoke of it. My mother mentioned once, long ago, a brother who had gone west seeking his fortune, but we had lost all contact with him years before her death. I had no idea he had settled near Willow Bend, or that he had died under circumstances that left behind such dangerous secrets." "Do you believe he truly sent you something valuable, some indication of where he might have hidden mining claims or wealth from his operation?" Alice shook her head slowly. "I received no such correspondence, not that I recall, though—" She paused, her expression suddenly thoughtful. "There was one letter, arriving shortly after my mother's death, that I never fully understood. It came from a lawyer's office, mentioning some small inheritance left to me by a relative I did not remember, along with a strange request that I preserve a particular book among my belongings, as it held sentimental value the deceased had wished me to have." "A book?" Joel asked, curiosity rising alongside cautious hope. "Do you still possess this book?" "It should be among my belongings, back in my trunk at Mrs. Pruitt's establishment," Alice said. "I confess I paid it little attention at the time, assuming it merely a sentimental token from a relative I could not properly remember. I never thought to examine it closely for any hidden significance." This revelation added new urgency to their situation. If the book Alice mentioned did indeed contain some clue to Hargrove's hidden wealth, whether a map, or coded directions, or simply information about mining claims, they needed to secure that item before the criminals who had taken Alice thought to search her remaining possessions in Willow Bend. "We should rest only briefly," Joel decided, "then continue toward town with all possible haste, taking the longer route I mentioned to avoid pursuit, but moving as quickly as safety allows. If those men realize the significance of items you left behind, they may attempt to retrieve them before we can secure the book's safety." They rested for perhaps 2 hours, sharing what remained of Joel's provisions and taking turns keeping watch for any sign of pursuit, before remounting and continuing their journey through the pre-dawn darkness. As the sun began rising behind them, painting the eastern sky in brilliant hues that seemed to promise better fortune ahead, Joel found himself studying Alice's profile with growing tenderness, marveling at her resilience despite the terror she had endured. "You never mentioned during our courtship that you carried such courage within you," he said softly, as they rode together through the gradually brightening landscape. Alice glanced back at him with a small, exhausted smile. "I did not know myself, until circumstances forced the discovery. Perhaps that is often the way of courage, Joel Conroy. It remains hidden until necessity calls it forth." "I am grateful necessity chose such a moment," Joel replied, though I wish with all my heart that you had never been forced to discover such reserves of strength through such terrible circumstances." They continued their journey through the morning hours, taking the longer southern route Joel had mentioned, following the creek's meandering path before eventually turning northeast toward Willow Bend. Around midday, they paused briefly to rest the horse and share a simple meal of remaining hardtack, during which Alice finally allowed herself to fully process the emotional weight of her ordeal, tears finally falling as the adrenaline that had sustained her through the previous night's terror gradually faded. Joel held her while she wept, offering what comfort he could through simple presence and gentle words, until her tears eventually subsided into exhausted calm. "We are almost home," he assured her. "A few more hours, and you will be safe within Willow Bend's protection, away from those who wished you harm. Will we truly be safe there, though?" Alice asked, voicing a concern that had been growing within Joel's own mind as well. "The sheriff seemed strangely uninterested in my disappearance, according to what you have told me. What if he holds some connection to these criminals, some reason to look the other way while they pursued their search for Hargrove's hidden wealth?" This question troubled Joel deeply, for he had wondered the same thing himself during his initial conversation with Sheriff Marsh. "We must proceed carefully," he finally said. "Perhaps we should not immediately announce your return to the entire town, but rather seek out those we trust most fully, gathering allies before we make our situation known more broadly." They resumed their journey with this cautious plan in mind, finally arriving at the outskirts of Willow Bend as afternoon light began softening toward evening. Rather than riding directly into town, Joel guided Samson toward his own ranch first, where Pete Sorensen and the other hands could provide additional protection and support while they determined their next course of action. Pete's relief at seeing them both alive and relatively unharmed was evident in every line of his weathered face as they rode into the ranch yard. "Thank the Lord," he exclaimed, hurrying forward to help Alice dismount. "We were preparing to ride out ourselves come morning, when your promised 3 days would have expired." "We encountered complications," Joel said grimly, before quickly explaining the situation. Alice's kidnapping, the criminals seeking Hargrove's hidden wealth, their dangerous escape, and the mysterious book that might hold clues to whatever secret had prompted such desperate action. Pete listened with growing concern, occasionally glancing toward the ranch house as if expecting danger to materialize from that direction at any moment. "You think Sheriff Marsh might be involved with these criminals?" "I cannot say for certain," Joel admitted, "but his lack of urgency regarding Alice's disappearance struck me as suspicious from the very beginning. We must proceed with caution until we better understand the full scope of this danger." "What do you propose?" Pete asked. Joel considered carefully before responding. "First, we must retrieve that book from Alice's trunk at Mrs. Pruitt's establishment before those criminals think to search there themselves. Second, we should seek out someone we trust absolutely, perhaps Judge Harmon from the county seat, rather than relying solely on local law enforcement that may be compromised. Judge Harmon comes through Willow Bend monthly, holding court for minor disputes," Pete confirmed. "His next visit should be within the week if memory serves correctly." "That may prove too long a delay," Alice interjected, speaking for the first time since their arrival at the ranch. "Those men will not simply abandon their search after my escape. If anything, they will grow more desperate and dangerous, knowing that I have alerted others to their presence and activities." Her words proved prophetic within hours, for as evening settled over the ranch, one of the younger hands, a boy named Timothy who had ridden into town for supplies, returned with troubling news. "They're strangers in town, boss, asking questions at the saloon about Miss Walker's whereabouts. Rough-looking sorts with guns worn low and manners to match." "Did they speak with Sheriff Marsh?" Joel asked. "That's the strange part," Timothy replied. "Seemed like they already knew each other, from how casual they spoke together outside the jailhouse. Sheriff Marsh even walked with them toward the general store, though I lost sight of what happened after that." This confirmation of Sheriff Marsh's likely involvement settled any remaining doubt in Joel's mind. They could not rely on local law enforcement for protection or assistance. Whatever solution they found would need to come through their own efforts, and whatever trusted allies they could gather among the ranch hands and townspeople who had not been compromised by whatever connection existed between Marsh and these criminals. "We need that book before they think to search Alice's trunk," Joel decided. "Pete, can you and perhaps 2 others ride into town after dark, retrieve Alice's belongings from Mrs. Pruitt's establishment without drawing attention?" Pete nodded firmly. "Consider it done, boss. Charlie Bannister and young Timothy here can accompany me. We'll move quiet and quick, back before midnight with whatever Miss Walker needs retrieved." While Pete organized this expedition, Joel remained at the ranch with Alice, both of them too exhausted and anxious to rest properly despite their bodies' obvious need for recovery after the previous night's ordeal. They sat together on the ranch house porch, watching stars gradually emerge across the darkening sky, finding comfort in each other's presence even amid uncertainty about what dangers might still lie ahead. "I never properly thanked you," Alice said softly, breaking a comfortable silence that had settled between them, "for risking everything to follow that map to rescue me from those men." "You never needed to thank me," Joel replied, taking her hand gently in his own. "From the moment I read your warning, I knew I would follow wherever that trail led, whatever danger it might bring. I could not simply abandon you to such terrible circumstances, Alice. My feelings for you run far too deep for such abandonment to ever cross my mind." Even before our wedding day arrived, Alice asked, a hint of her earlier composure returning alongside gentle teasing. "You loved me even then, despite our brief courtship?" Joel considered his response carefully, wanting to speak complete truth rather than simple romantic platitudes. "I believe I began loving you from your very first letter, Alice Walker, though I did not fully recognize such feelings until I saw you step down from that stagecoach and realized how desperately I hoped you would choose to remain here with me, despite everything unfamiliar and challenging about this frontier life." Alice's eyes glistened with emotion in the fading evening light. "I felt something similar, though I confess I was too frightened by such intense feelings to fully acknowledge them, even to myself. Coming so far from everything familiar, trusting my future to a stranger's letters and promises, required more courage than I believed myself to possess. Yet from our very first meeting, something within me recognized safety and rightness in your presence, Joel Conroy, feelings I had never expected to discover through such an unconventional arrangement." They sat together in comfortable silence after these confessions, watching the stars multiply overhead as darkness fully claimed the Kansas sky, until eventually the sound of returning horses announced Pete's successful return from his expedition into town. "We retrieved everything without incident," Pete reported, helping unload Alice's trunk from the back of the wagon they had used for transport. "Mrs. Pruitt seemed relieved beyond measure to learn Miss Walker survived her ordeal and readily assisted us in gathering all her belongings for safekeeping here at the ranch." "Did you encounter any of the strangers or Sheriff Marsh himself?" Joel asked. "We saw lamplight in the jailhouse as we passed," Pete confirmed, "but made no direct contact. Better to remain cautious until we understand the full extent of whatever corruption exists within our local law enforcement." Alice immediately set about searching through her trunk, finally locating the mysterious book her mother's letter had mentioned. A modest volume of poetry, its leather binding worn with age, apparently containing works by various English Romantic poets. She examined it carefully in the lamplight, checking for any hidden compartments or unusual markings that might explain its supposed significance. "I see nothing unusual," she said, growing frustrated after several minutes of careful examination. "Simply a book of poetry, containing nothing beyond the printed verses themselves." Joel took the volume from her hands, examining it with fresh eyes. He flipped through several pages, noting nothing immediately suspicious, until he reached the book's final pages, where he discovered something that made his heart race with sudden excitement. "Alice, look here." These final pages appear blank, yet the paper feels different from the rest of the volume, thicker somehow, as if something has been pressed between these leaves. Alice leaned closer, examining the pages Joel indicated. Together, they carefully worked the pages apart, discovering that 2 sheets near the book's end had been glued together, creating a hidden pocket between them. Using a thin knife blade, Joel carefully separated these pages, revealing a folded document that had been concealed within. A hand-drawn map, remarkably similar in style to the one Alice herself had created during her kidnapping, showing detailed directions to what appeared to be a specific location within the abandoned Hargrove mine. "This must be what those criminals sought," Alice breathed, studying the document with growing amazement. "My uncle's hidden treasure map, concealed within this book of poetry that he apparently sent to me before his death, though I never realized its true significance until this very moment." The map showed directions to a specific chamber within the mine, marked with symbols that suggested substantial mineral deposits, along with a brief note in what must have been Hargrove's own handwriting. "For my niece Alice, whom I never had the pleasure of meeting, but whose mother I remember fondly from our childhood together. Should circumstances ever bring you west, know that I have left something of value hidden within these hills, discovered through years of careful prospecting that the official assay reports never revealed. Use this wealth wisely, and remember always that family bonds, even those separated by great distance and time, remain precious beyond measure." Alice read these words with tears forming in her eyes, mourning an uncle she had never known yet who had apparently thought of her with such tenderness in his final years. "He wanted to provide for me," she said softly, "despite never having met me in person. This explains everything, why those criminals believed I might possess knowledge of his hidden wealth." "We must decide carefully how to proceed," Joel said, studying the map with careful consideration. "These criminals will not simply abandon their search now that you have escaped their custody. If anything, learning that we retrieved this book will only increase their desperation and danger." "Perhaps we should use this map to our advantage," Alice suggested, an idea forming as she spoke. "If we can lure them into some trap, using their own greed against them, perhaps we might finally end this danger permanently, rather than simply hiding and hoping they eventually abandon their pursuit." Pete, who had been listening to this conversation with growing interest, nodded approvingly. "That's mighty clever thinking, Miss Walker. We could send word that we've found something at the mine, draw them into a position where we hold the advantage, then have them arrested by honest law enforcement once we prove their crimes." "But we cannot trust Sheriff Marsh for that arrest," Joel reminded them. "We need someone with authority beyond local corruption. Judge Harmon, perhaps, or the territorial marshal if we can reach him in time." They spent the following hours planning their strategy carefully, aware that time worked against them as the criminals grew increasingly desperate in their search. Pete volunteered to ride toward the county seat that very night, seeking out Judge Harmon or any federal marshal who might provide the authority needed to ensure proper justice once their trap succeeded. Meanwhile, Joel and Alice, along with several trusted ranch hands, prepared to set their plan into motion. They would spread word through carefully selected channels that Alice had discovered evidence of her uncle's hidden wealth, information calculated to reach the criminals' ears, while avoiding direct exposure that might allow Sheriff Marsh to interfere with their strategy. 2 days passed in tense preparation, during which Pete successfully located not Judge Harmon, who remained occupied with matters in a distant county, but rather a federal marshal named Wyatt Cole, who happened to be passing through the territory investigating claims of corruption among local law enforcement officials. Marshal Cole listened with grave interest to Pete's account of the situation, immediately recognizing the potential connection between Sheriff Marsh's apparent negligence and broader patterns of corruption. he had been investigating throughout the territory. This confirms suspicions I have held for some months now, Marshal Cole explained upon arriving at the Conroy Ranch, accompanied by 2 deputy marshals he had recruited for backup. Sheriff Marsh has long been suspected of accepting bribes to overlook various criminal activities throughout this region. If we can catch these men in the act of pursuing Miss Walker's supposed treasure, with clear evidence of their criminal intentions, we may finally have sufficient cause to remove Marsh from his position permanently while properly prosecuting these criminals for their crimes. With federal authority now backing their efforts, Joel and Alice finalized their plan for the following evening. They would spread word through Willow Bend that Alice intended to visit the old Hargrove mine personally, ostensibly to investigate her uncle's claim now that she possessed knowledge of its location. This information, carefully leaked to reach the criminals through channels connected to Sheriff Marsh's network, would hopefully draw them into a trap where Marshal Cole and his deputies could apprehend them in the act of pursuing their criminal intentions. The following evening arrived with tension thick enough to feel like a physical presence throughout the ranch. Alice, dressed in practical riding clothes rather than anything resembling her interrupted wedding attire, prepared to ride toward the mine alongside Joel, while Marshal Cole and his deputies positioned themselves strategically among the surrounding rocks and vegetation, ready to spring their trap at the appropriate moment. "Are you certain you wish to participate directly in this plan?" Joel asked Alice as they prepared to depart, his concern for her safety evident despite his confidence in their overall strategy. "You could remain safely at the ranch while others handle this confrontation." Alice's expression showed determination mixed with lingering fear from her previous ordeal, yet ultimately resolve won out over hesitation. "These men stole my sense of safety and violated my trust in this new life I sought to build. I want to see them brought to justice, to know with my own eyes that they can no longer threaten anyone else as they threatened me." They rode toward the mine as darkness settled fully across the landscape, following the same general route Alice's original map had indicated, though this time with full knowledge of their destination and purpose, rather than desperate uncertainty. As they approached the mine entrance, Joel spotted movement among the shadows near the old mining equipment, confirming that their trap had successfully drawn its intended targets. The bearded man who had led Alice's kidnapping stepped forward from the shadows, flanked by his 2 associates, his expression showing surprise mixed with dangerous anticipation as he recognized Alice and Joel approaching. So the little bird returns to her captor's territory and brings her rancher lover along for good measure. Have you finally decided to share your uncle's secrets, or does this visit signal some foolish attempt at rescue that will only end in further tragedy? "We know where Hargrove hid his discovery," Alice said, her voice steady despite the danger evident in the confrontation. "I have decided that rather than allow you to threaten innocent people further, I will simply show you the location myself, in exchange for your promise to leave this territory permanently and never trouble anyone in Willow Bend again." The bearded man laughed harshly and sounded utterly devoid of humor. "You expect me to trust such a promise from someone I have already wronged so thoroughly? I think not, Miss Walker. Instead, you will show us this location, and then perhaps we will decide your fate based on how cooperative you prove yourself during that final revelation." This was the signal Marshal Cole had been waiting for, confirmation of the criminal's continued threatening behavior and clear criminal intent. From positions hidden among the rocks and mining equipment, Marshal Cole and his deputies emerged with weapons drawn, their presence startling the 3 criminals into immediate defensive postures. "Federal marshals, drop your weapons and surrender immediately." Marshal Cole's voice carried authority that brooked no argument, though the bearded man's hand instinctively moved toward his own holstered weapon, despite the obvious futility of resistance against 3 armed lawmen who clearly held tactical advantage. For a tense moment, violence seemed inevitable, as the bearded man's associates exchanged glances suggesting they contemplated fighting rather than surrendering to federal authority. But cooler judgment eventually prevailed, as all three criminals recognized the impossible odds against them and slowly raised their hands in surrender, their weapons clattering to the ground at Marshal Cole's continued insistence. "You will answer for kidnapping Miss Walker, for threatening violence against innocent civilians, and for whatever connection exists between your activities and local law enforcement corruption," Marshal Cole announced, as his deputies moved forward to secure the surrendered criminals with restraints. "I suspect Sheriff Marsh will have considerable explanation to provide once we return to Willow Bend with this evidence of his likely complicity in your schemes." As the criminals were secured and prepared for transport back to face federal justice, Joel finally allowed himself to relax slightly, the tension that had gripped him since discovering Alice's disappearance finally beginning to ease. He turned to Alice, finding her watching the scene with an expression that mixed relief with lingering traces of the fear she had endured throughout this entire ordeal. "It is finally ending," he said softly, moving closer to offer comfort through simple physical presence. "These men can no longer threaten you or anyone else in Willow Bend." Alice leaned into his embrace, finally allowing herself to fully process the emotional weight of everything she had experienced. "I never imagined my wedding day would transform into such an adventure," she said, a hint of wry humor emerging despite everything they had endured. "Though I suppose this proves the courage I hoped to discover within myself when I first answered your advertisement all those months ago." "You have proven courage beyond anything I could have imagined," Joel replied, "though I hope our future together might involve somewhat less danger and adventure, at least of this particular variety." Marshal Cole approached them as his deputies finished securing the criminals for transport, his expression showing genuine respect for how they had helped expose both the immediate criminal threat and the broader corruption within local law enforcement. "Miss Walker, Mr. Conroy, I want to commend your courage and cleverness in helping resolve this dangerous situation. Sheriff Marsh will face federal charges for his complicity, and these men will answer for their crimes before proper judicial authority. Your uncle's discovery, whatever it proves to be, should now remain safely available for Miss Walker's rightful claim, without fear of further criminal interference." "What of the mine itself?" Joel asked. "Should we investigate now, or wait for proper documentation of Alice's inheritance rights?" "I would recommend proper legal documentation first," Marshal Cole advised. "Judge Harmon can help establish Miss Walker's rightful claim to her uncle's discovery, ensuring everything proceeds according to proper legal channels, rather than risking future complications from improperly documented claims." They returned to Willow Bend that same night, escorting the captured criminals to proper federal custody, while Marshal Cole's deputies simultaneously moved to arrest Sheriff Marsh, whose panicked attempt at flight upon learning of his associates' capture only served to confirm his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Within days, federal investigation revealed extensive evidence of Marsh's corruption, including bribes accepted from various criminal enterprises throughout the territory in exchange for deliberately ignoring their activities. With Marsh removed from his position and awaiting federal trial, Willow Bend found itself in need of new law enforcement leadership. Pete Sorensen, respected throughout the community for his role in helping resolve this crisis, was approached by town leaders about potentially serving as interim sheriff until proper elections could be held, an offer he accepted with characteristic humble dedication to serving his community well. Meanwhile, Judge Harmon, upon his next scheduled visit to Willow Bend, reviewed the documentation regarding Hargrove's mining claim and Alice's inheritance rights, ultimately confirming her legal ownership of whatever wealth the abandoned mine contained. With this legal matter properly resolved, Alice and Joel finally felt free to investigate the mine's secrets without fear of further criminal interference or legal complications. They organized a small expedition, including Pete and several trusted ranch hands, to explore the chamber marked on Hargrove's hidden map. What they discovered exceeded even their hopeful expectations. A substantial vein of high-grade silver ore that Hargrove had apparently discovered shortly before his death, wealth significant enough to secure Alice's financial independence for the remainder of her life, and to substantially benefit the Conroy Ranch's future prosperity as well. "Your uncle left you quite a legacy," Joel said, as they examined samples of the silver ore extracted during their initial exploration of the newly discovered vein. "This discovery will require proper mining operations to fully develop, but even preliminary estimates suggest wealth beyond anything either of us anticipated when this entire ordeal began. I would trade every ounce of this silver for the terror I experienced during those days of captivity," Alice replied, though her tone carried more reflection than bitterness. "Yet I recognize the strange blessing hidden within such terrible circumstances. My uncle's final gift to a niece he never met has secured not only my future, but perhaps our future together as well." With their immediate crisis resolved and Alice's inheritance properly secured, thoughts naturally turned toward the wedding that had been so dramatically interrupted just days before. Reverend Hastings, upon learning of Alice's safe return and the successful resolution of the criminal threat that had disrupted their original ceremony, immediately offered to reschedule their wedding at the earliest convenient date. "I believe," Alice said, as they discussed timing for their rescheduled ceremony, "that our wedding should happen as soon as possible without further delay. I have learned through recent experience that life offers no guarantees of tomorrow, and I wish to begin our married life together without additional waiting." Joel readily agreed, and within a week, Willow Bend once again prepared for the wedding of Joel Conroy and Alice Walker, though this ceremony would carry additional significance given everything they had endured together to reach this moment. The entire town, having heard various accounts of their dramatic adventure through the local gossip networks that inevitably spread such stories, turned out in force to witness this joyous occasion, eager to celebrate not just a wedding, but the triumph of love and courage over criminal corruption and danger. The day of their rescheduled wedding dawned bright and clear, with none of the uncertainty that had shadowed their original ceremony. Alice wore a new dress specially ordered from Kansas City, delivered just in time for this joyous occasion, its pale blue fabric complementing her wheat-colored hair beautifully as she prepared for the ceremony in Mrs. Pruitt's establishment, surrounded by well-wishing townswomen who had become genuine friends during her time in Willow Bend. Joel waited at the small church, his nervous anticipation entirely different from the anxiety he had felt during their original wedding day preparations. This time, he knew with absolute certainty that his bride would appear, that no criminal scheme or dangerous kidnapping would interrupt this celebration of their love. Pete Sorensen stood beside him as best man, having earned this honor through his crucial role in helping rescue Alice and resolve their crisis. When Alice finally walked down the church aisle, escorted by Mrs. Pruitt, who had become something of a surrogate mother figure during Alice's time in Willow Bend, Joel felt his heart swell with love so profound it nearly overwhelmed him with emotion. She moved with confidence and grace, her earlier fear and trauma having transformed into quiet strength that radiated from every aspect of her bearing. Reverend Hastings performed the ceremony with obvious personal investment in this couple's happiness, having followed their dramatic story with the same interest as the rest of the town. When he finally pronounced them husband and wife, the small church erupted in enthusiastic applause and celebration, everyone present recognizing that they witnessed not just a simple wedding, but the culmination of remarkable courage and devotion that had overcome extraordinary obstacles. "I love you, Alice Conroy," Joel whispered as they shared their first kiss as officially married partners, using her new surname with evident pride and joy. "I love you too, Joel Conroy," Alice replied, her eyes bright with happy tears. "Though I believe we should perhaps avoid quite so much adventure during future anniversaries." Their wedding celebration continued late into the evening, with the entire town contributing food and music for an impromptu dance that filled the church grounds with joy and laughter. Even Marshal Cole, who had remained in the area briefly to complete paperwork regarding the criminal prosecution, attended the celebration, offering his personal congratulations to the couple whose courage had helped expose significant corruption throughout the territory. In the months following their wedding, Alice and Joel worked together to properly develop the silver mine discovered through her uncle's hidden map, hiring experienced mining engineers to establish safe and efficient extraction operations. The wealth generated through this enterprise allowed them to significantly expand the Conroy Ranch, purchasing additional grazing land and improving their cattle operation with new breeding stock that increased both the quantity and quality of their herds. They also used a portion of their newfound wealth to benefit the broader Willow Bend community, funding improvements to the town's school, church, and other public facilities. Alice, remembering her own father's profession as a schoolteacher, took particular interest in ensuring Willow Bend's children received quality education, eventually helping establish a proper schoolhouse with dedicated teaching staff, rather than the informal arrangements that had previously served the community's educational needs. Pete Sorensen, having proven his capability during his interim service as sheriff, was eventually elected to that position permanently by grateful townspeople who recognized his honest dedication to justice and community welfare. Under his leadership, Willow Bend's law enforcement earned back the trust that had been damaged by Marsh's corruption, ensuring that future residents could rely on proper protection rather than the compromised system that had nearly cost Alice her life. As for the criminals who had kidnapped Alice, along with Sheriff Marsh himself, all faced appropriate federal prosecution for their crimes. Marsh received a lengthy prison sentence for his corruption and complicity in criminal activities, while the three men who had directly kidnapped Alice and threatened violence against her faced even more severe consequences, given the serious nature of their crimes. Justice, delayed though it initially seemed given local law enforcement's compromised state, ultimately prevailed through federal intervention, and the courage that Alice and Joel had shown in exposing the full scope of criminal activity threatening their community. 2 years after their wedding, Alice gave birth to their first child, a son they named Samuel after Joel's father, who had originally established the Conroy Ranch decades earlier. The boy inherited his mother's wheat-colored hair and his father's steady gray eyes, along with what quickly became apparent as a naturally curious and adventurous spirit that occasionally worried his parents given their own experience with dangerous adventures. "He will need careful watching as he grows," Joel observed, cradling his infant son shortly after his birth, given his parents' history of finding themselves embroiled in dramatic circumstances. Alice laughed softly from her position in their bed, exhausted but joyful following the birth. "Perhaps we should simply teach him early the importance of leaving helpful maps behind, should he ever find himself in circumstances requiring rescue by loving family members." Their family continued growing over subsequent years, with a daughter named Rebecca born 3 years after Samuel, followed by another son named Thomas 2 years after that. Each child brought new joy and challenges to their expanding household, while the ranch itself continued prospering through careful management and the ongoing success of their silver mining operations. Alice never forgot her Uncle Hargrove, whose final gift had proven so significant to her future happiness despite the terrible circumstances surrounding its discovery. She commissioned a proper headstone for his previously unmarked grave, ensuring that future generations would recognize the man whose careful prospecting and thoughtful legacy had ultimately connected her to the life and love she found in Willow Bend. The book of poetry that had contained Hargrove's hidden map became a treasured family heirloom, displayed prominently in their home's library, alongside other books they gradually collected as their family and prosperity grew. Alice often read from this volume to her children as they grew older, sharing not just the poems themselves, but the remarkable story of how this seemingly simple book had led to such profound changes in their family's fortune and happiness. As for Mrs. Prout, she remained a beloved figure throughout Alice and Joel's marriage, serving almost as a grandmother figure to their growing children despite lacking any actual blood relation. She often recounted to visitors and townspeople alike the dramatic story of Alice's disappearance and rescue, embellishing certain details with each retelling, until the tale achieved almost legendary status throughout the broader territory, inspiring other young women considering similar mail-order bride arrangements with hope that true love and happiness might indeed await them on the frontier, despite whatever challenges and dangers such arrangements might initially present. Marshal Wyatt Cole, whose intervention had proven so crucial to resolving their crisis, remained in occasional contact with Alice and Joel through correspondence over subsequent years, updating them on various law enforcement matters throughout the territory, while also sharing news of his own eventual marriage to a woman he met during his continued federal service. Their friendship, forged through crisis and mutual respect, endured long after the immediate danger that had first brought them together had faded into simple shared history. 10 years after their dramatic wedding day, Joel and Alice stood together on their ranch house porch, watching their 3 children play in the yard, while the Kansas sunset painted the sky in the same brilliant colors that had first drawn Alice's attention during their early courtship years before. The ranch had grown substantially through their combined efforts, becoming one of the most successful operations in the entire territory, while their silver mining interests had provided financial security that few families in their circumstances could have imagined achieving. "Do you ever regret answering my advertisement all those years ago?" Joel asked, echoing a question he had asked once before during their early courtship, though circumstances had changed so dramatically since that initial conversation. Alice leaned against him, watching their children with obvious maternal affection and pride. "I regret only the terror of those days when I was taken from you, and the fear you must have experienced not knowing whether you would find me safe or lose me entirely to whatever fate those criminals intended. But everything else, Joel, every challenge and adventure we have shared together, every joy we have discovered in building this life and family together, I regret none of it. I found exactly the courage and love I hoped to discover when I first decided to leave everything familiar behind and travel west toward an uncertain future. I love you, Alice Conroy," Joel said softly, using words that had become a treasured daily ritual throughout their years together. "Today, tomorrow, and for however many years God grants us together on this earth." "I love you too, Joel Conroy," Alice replied, turning to meet his gaze with eyes still bright with the same devotion that had first drawn them together through those exchanged letters so many years before. "Now and always, through whatever adventures our future might yet bring." They remained together on that porch as evening fully settled over their ranch, their children's laughter carrying on the gentle breeze, their hearts full with the profound gratitude of 2 people who had faced extraordinary danger and discovered, through that very crisis, a love strong enough to overcome any obstacle life might present. The map that Alice had left behind on that terrifying night, initially born from desperate necessity, had ultimately led not just to her rescue, but to a lifetime of love, family, and prosperity that neither of them could have fully imagined when they first began their tentative correspondence across the vast distances that had once separated their very different worlds. Their story became something of local legend throughout Willow Bend and the surrounding territory, told and retold by those who had witnessed or participated in the dramatic events of Alice's kidnapping and rescue. Yet beyond the adventure and danger that had marked their unusual courtship and marriage, what truly endured was the simple, profound truth that love, when tested by extraordinary circumstances, could prove strong enough to overcome any challenge, transforming even the most terrifying crisis into the foundation for a lifetime of happiness, partnership, and devoted family life on the wild frontier they had chosen to call home.